And then, hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you could join us today for our special interview with my dear friend, Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Dr. Bass is a historian. She's an author. She's a deep thinker, and I believe a visionary. She has a way of looking at things in history and being able to see the lessons and help us as we process the ongoing history that we're currently living into, and begin to help us construct something beautiful in this time, thinking about how we have gone in and out of different waves of things like this in our own past. So welcome. I'm so glad that you are here with us, Diana. And so I am hopeful that you will be able to talk to us a little bit about some of these things. And I guess my first question is, what are the lessons of pandemics or economic depressions? What are the things that you have seen from the past as you've been reflecting? And how could those lessons be informative to where we are right now?
Well, that's a big question, Anna. And it's nice to be with you. It's nice to be with you today. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about your question is when you say, what are some of the things from pandemics and depressions from the past that we've learned about today? And immediately that question points to something that is true about this particular moment. And that is, we have historical records of pandemics and really significant epidemics, like significant epidemics of cholera or smallpox, things like that in fairly more recent history. There was in the 19th century a big epidemic in Memphis that nearly destroyed the town, ran people out of the city. So we have things like that, and then of course we have the big historical record of the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century. But what we don't see, and then we have the history of the Great Depression, or other kinds of economic crises, like in the late 1850s, and how churches responded to those. But it's a rare time when you see the two things intersect as completely as they are right now. And so that makes what we're all going through, I think, a lot scarier and a bit without historical precedent. It doesn't mean that we can't learn from the past. Obviously we can, but we have to be thoughtful, I think, about how we employ the learnings of the past.
So what are the particular learnings from different pieces of the past that may be helpful in informing how we may be putting together some of the things in the present?
Yeah, one of the, I'll just take them sort of one at a time.
Go ahead.
And when it comes to health crises and epidemics and how Christians have responded to those in the past, one of the very interesting things about the history of Christianity, and there are some historians of ancient Christianity who believe that the early growth of the church was actually spurred on by epidemics in the ancient Roman world. And we tend to think about it as some miraculous thing. Everybody goes out preaching, and all of a sudden people are just converting. But what happened? We do have evidence that there was, in particular, one plague where the church grew quite a bit, and apparently that has to do with the fact that most of the people who were adherents of other religions, or who didn't have any kind of particular religious tradition at all, left Rome during this plague, and Christians stayed. And the Christians earned quite a reputation. I think it was called the Plague of Galen. I'd have to go and check my books. But Christians stayed in this plague, and that gave them the reputation of people who were fearlessly compassionate. And it was very impressive to the Romans, because Romans, they actually had valor as a sort of a fundamental social and spiritual virtue. And so that they saw that the Christians were courageous and willing to risk themselves and face their own deaths in order to care for people who were really, really, really sick, and to bury the dead and do all the different things that Christians did during that plague, really multiplied the witness, of the early church. And that has frequently been the case, is that some sort of health crisis, some sort of really frightening disease would strike a city, and oftentimes the people who went towards the front lines were monks and nuns and regular lay people who later would become saints because of the work that they did among the sick and the dying. And this has been something that Christians have valued, for a really, really, really long time, is that the people who follow Jesus are the people who do whatever it takes to make sure other people's lives are saved. And I mentioned Memphis a moment ago. That's a fairly famous case where there was, I believe it was cholera. And what happened was the only people who basically stayed behind were a group of Episcopal, not Catholic in this case, but Episcopal nuns. And they poured themselves out in service to the sick. As a matter of fact, and all the nuns wound up dying. And they are remembered in history as the martyrs of Memphis. And there's, in the Episcopal Cathedral in Memphis, a beautiful shrine to these women who saved others but lost their own lives. So that makes me think about, well, what is the equivalent, today? Because one of the things that I saw fairly early on was a whole bunch of Christians saying, well, people are sick, so what we have to do is we have to go onto the front lines. We have to save lives. And that is a Christian impulse, is to risk ourselves in order that others would be saved. But what's fascinating about this particular illness, this particular virus, is what we're being asked to risk is not, in a sense, going onto the front lines, unless you're a medical doctor or a nurse, or someone who is directly feeding hungry people, or who has some sort of direct need to be on the front lines. The front lines are what you and I are doing. The front line for most Christian people is staying home. And we're not doing it out of fear. We're doing this self-quarantining piece because this is the very thing that demonstrates love for our neighbor. And it's counterintuitive and it's kind of wacky and it actually hurts, but I don't know about you. I would rather be out volunteering, checking patients into a hospital, or I would rather be out there's a very poor sort of corridor of my neighborhood that's less than a mile away from my house, where huge numbers of immigrants and economically disadvantaged people live. And there's actually a wonderful Methodist church over there that I've supported financially for years, and I know the minister very well. And this week, it became a site for the Jose Andres feeding program to make sure that people in that corridor, that's actually what we call it in the neighborhood, the corridor, are fed. And so my first impulse was, I'm going to go volunteer, and my husband, who is 64 and I'm 61, we both kind of looked at each other and said, well, maybe we should just send money. Because the truth of it is if we go and volunteer, one thing, we would be in the high risk group not only for getting the disease ourselves, but even if we didn't get the disease, we might wind up transmitting it to somebody else. And so, the best volunteers right now are people who have had it and who might now be immunized to it, or people who are younger, or who are people who are professionals and have the right protective equipment. And so what was my first impulse? Run towards the problem and help to fix it, which I think is the impulse of lots of people who are Methodists, is you run towards the problem and you do good. Mm-hmm. Right now, the doing good part is to hold back and to stay at home and try to figure out other ways of doing good without putting our bodies in the way of becoming vectors of the disease. And that I can't think of another moment in history when Christians have had to make that choice knowingly. That could have helped during the Black Death. If everybody decided to stay home for 2 months, maybe it would have, limited the spread. But as it was in the Middle Ages, everybody poured into the churches and prayed to God to, protect them from the Black Death. And that was exactly the worst thing to do. Everybody got sick, including the priests. And, and the church was devastated, as well as society, by the Black Death. But people didn't know that then. People just thought, we're doing what we need to do. We're going to church. We're taking care of the poor. We're taking care of the sick. So the question becomes, the truth of the matter is, whenever there is an extreme health crisis, Christians take care of their neighbors. And then the question becomes for us, what does taking care of our neighbor mean now? Now that we know other things about science, now that we know some things about this disease, now that we, have other mechanisms of doing good, what does it mean? So that's the pandemic question, I think. What does it mean to take care of our neighbors now? How do we rush toward, in air quotes, the illness in an age when staying at home is the best choice?
I appreciate you being willing to put that out there. And I also appreciate that your little nod there to, they did not have the information that we currently have about science, that our knowledge has expanded. And that's why theoretically, our theology and our theological mindset has to expand with it. Right. Because as we learn, it's not that God changed, but we have changed and we have grown and we are learning. And then we're trying to figure out then, what does God ask of us in this moment in time? What is the most loving thing to do? So I appreciate your thoughts about that. But I also wanted to, that was a zoom in, and I want to expand out too for a second. Because I think it's wonderful that we're challenging folks to continue to find their personal piety and their faithfulness to God and to love of neighbor by staying home. And as an RN, I particularly appreciate that because I really don't want to, I'm an on-call kind of person if it gets really bad. I don't want to do that, but I realize that I do have a skill set to do it if I have to. But I would rather everybody please stay home so that doesn't become a requirement for me or for other healthcare workers, not just here, but throughout the country. But zooming out for a minute, I really do think that there are some interesting things that I've heard you say about the lessons of particularly how the church changed through the plague. And it's like the church was one thing prior to the plague. The church was a very different thing after the plague. And then going into economics, I've appreciated some of your thoughts, and I hope you'll share them, about the church prior to the economic depression of the 1930s, and then what happened in social justice movements and whatnot, what thrived or helped the church to thrive and movements to thrive, including going into FDR and whatnot, during those first few decades of the last century.
Yeah, well, I can quickly answer the question about what happened to the church as a result of some of these these historical health crises. And the one I gave the example of is that the one in the first years of Christianity, during the time it was just coming into the world, it actually functioned as an evangelistic device. You know, people were just so impressed that Christians were willing to die to take care of their neighbors. They couldn't believe it. And so, and then there were people who recovered and who had been cared for by Christians, and they might not have ever known a Christian before. And so all of a sudden, this kind of weird, unacceptable fringe religion it was an extraordinary ancient world PR campaign for the church. And that is one example of something that happened to the church during a health crisis. But that's really kind of the exception rather than the rule. Although many individual people who were extraordinary figures during health crises, and doctors and nurses who became missionaries and, went to the far reaches of the world and shared really good medical knowledge with new people groups that had never been exposed to Christianity before. Those folks led to a huge expansion of the church in places like South America and Africa and the Pacific Islands. So there is that element of it. But the other element is when there is a pandemic, an epidemic, a plague, and Christians rush towards the illness, a lot of Christians get sick and die. And a lot of Christians who have got sick and died were pastors, bishops, people who had monks and nuns in monasteries and convents, because as we're finding out, like with, senior centers, when you put a lot of people in a small place, and prisons, when you put a lot of people in a small place and they live together, the epidemic spreads like wildfire. So monasteries were places of huge amounts of transmission in the Middle Ages in particular. So what happened was there was the heroic aspect of healing, which people took seriously and noticed, and church history is valorized. But there's also this other aspect where the structures, the traditional structures of the church were, in some cases, in some towns, especially during the Black Death, almost wiped out by the plague. Some of the first people to die were the priests. And, well, what do you do then? It's like, wait a second, the church, and we've seen pictures of this today, where in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I believe it was closed for Easter. And the story said this is the first time since 1379 that the church had been closed. And that's because everybody died who was taking care of the church. And so they locked all the churches in towns and cities all across Christendom and beyond. And guess what that did? Is that then created a shift. Lay people said, well, what are we going to do? Has God deserted us? How are we going to celebrate the Mass? Who gets to preach sermons? And so the crisis that came to the church when it's a huge part of its leadership class was wiped out, became a sort of a stimulus for huge amounts of lay piety and lay ministry to emerge across Christendom. And there are historians, and historians love to argue about things, so not everyone is in complete agreement with this. But I take the side of those who say that this became part of the social crisis that 100 years later initiates the beginning of the Reformation. Is that this erosion of the traditional structures of practice, the traditional outlets for the Mass, for the liturgy to be celebrated, led to a sort of an increase of these more radical lay-centered pietistic movements, and those movements over the course of the next 100 years really challenged the structure of medieval Europe and eventually give us the Reformation. And so that's really an interesting history. You know, it's on one hand, it's a great picture of how the church can grow during a crisis and how some of the people we hold close as saints did truly heroic things. And those things brought forth, I think, the healing ministry of the church in profound and beautiful ways that we still remember today and celebrate today. And then on the other hand, the structures of the church themselves suffered a great deal, and they could not maintain business as usual. It was impossible to do church as they were used to doing it. And so lay people began to take that on themselves. And then that eventually initiates a crisis that goes forward 100 years and causes a huge fracture in Christendom. So I think that's.
And do you feel?
I think that's an incredibly nuanced history.
Yeah. Do you feel that? I mean, because when we think about the Middle Ages, I kind of think that things were much slower for that period of time. And right now, it feels like comparatively things are on hyperdrive. And so lessons that might have taken decades or even a century to learn because things were terrible but paced. People couldn't get to the other side of the world in a day. People were not connected in the same ways that we are today. And we did not have global economic systems in the same way that we have now. Things were more tribalistic and locally centered. And so now that we're all connected in these incredible ways, we can take some lessons from the Middle Ages on things that force the church into a redefinition of itself. But then we also have to look at lessons of, like I was watching something that you were saying about the Depression and things that financial shifts during the Depression and whatnot. But if we could take those lessons and bring them into today, things may happen much, much faster. And so some of the lessons that I was appreciating from the Depression that you were talking about was that churches that were resistant, and we could even talk from a spiritual level about resisting the flow of what God is doing in the world and the dangers of that. But people who were resisting these changes, who wanted it to be the way that it was in 1927 when it's 1933, people that were still holding on to that and not able to adjust to the new realities, those churches didn't do very well. The churches that did better were the churches that were, if I'm remembering some of the things I heard from you the other day, Pentecostal churches, or even liberal churches with a social impact focus. Like, so people that, as you were just saying about laity and lay empowered ministry, people that were really focused on the sort of charismatic movement and empowerment of the lay people and people in general, and churches that were relatable, that made a difference. I would you speak to that a minute?
Yeah, well, see, that's the other question, is the economic question. And so these kinds of pandemics and epidemics do always have religious consequences, they have economic consequences, they have social consequences. And so we have those as sort of things that we can study. And then we have this other thing where it wasn't caught up in an epidemic, but we have the Great Depression, a global economic stoppage that created havoc on every corner of the planet. And so that's kind of, we clearly have that right now too. It may have been initiated by an epidemic, but or a pandemic, but what has happened, of course, is that we have a global now economic crisis that could plunge. I was just reading some stuff today, as many as, I think it was 2 billion more people on the planet into the deepest forms of poverty, especially after, we human beings have actually had a lot of success over the last 30 years in drawing people out of the deepest levels of poverty across the planet. There are actually a smaller percentage of people who are in the most desperate straits than there have been before in human history. But now it looks like all those people are going to go right back to where it was, and as if the last 30 years of anti-poverty activism and work and investment didn't even happen. And so this is really frightening, and it's frightening for the poorest of the poor. It's frightening for middle class people. I don't know if the 1% are frightened, but I've heard that rich people, for example, have literally gotten on planes and gone off to New Zealand where there's no cases of disease so that they can hide. And so there's things happening, kind of in every economic class. So then we look at something like the Great Depression, and that's what you and I were talking about before. And I was having, I'm kind of weird, I guess. I was having a really good time as a historian over the weekend, reading some of the materials about the Great Depression and what the results were on. Specifically, I was very specifically interested in mainline churches in the United States, and that's something we share. And so these are basically the 4 things that I was able to pull out of several different articles and books that have been written about the Great Depression. I think these are 4 really fascinating points for church people and church leaders to keep in mind. The first thing was entering into the Great Depression in 1929. There was already strain on religious institutions. Is that a lot of conventional religious institutions in the United States were already suffering membership declines and giving declines. And the churches that were under the worst strain before 1929 were the churches and institutions most likely to fail during the Great Depression. So already stressed institutions had a higher level of failure than institutions that were more even-keeled going into the Depression. And the period of time between 1925 and roughly 39 is known in historical circles as the Great Religious Depression, because so many churches closed. Mission boards no longer had money to send out missionaries. Seminaries were under stress. I mean, it was very, 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 very difficult. And a lot of those problems had started before 1929. And so that's an interesting point. I mean, obviously the main line has been struggling with membership and money problems before this. And so that means we are in a much more fragile place than we would have been otherwise, if we would have dealt with some of those problems in advance. Okay, so then the second point is, well, then who made it? Who escaped the Great Religious Depression, as it were? And one of the things that's fascinating is what you just said, is that despite the fact that the stressed religious, the more conventional religious institutions struggled, smaller, more agile, and very highly innovative groups succeeded. And so it was this 15, 20-year period that Pentecostal groups grew. Small, sort of independent Baptist type churches grew. And I think the reasons for this is not necessarily because, they stressed magical sort of stuff or that their theology was right or what have you. But what they did is that they were able to not ask permission to do stuff. And so in the main line right now, one of the biggest arguments that's happening in online space is, can you serve communion online? And all these people are arguing about it, and bishops are saying no, and conference superintendents are saying no, and some people are saying yes. So there's all this conflict, and people are arguing with each other, and then there's, the rule book is brought to bear on the moment. And I can tell you that that's exactly the wrong thing to do historically. is that the groups that succeeded in the 20s and 30s were groups that had essentially no rule books. And what they did is they went out there just on the sort of the impulse of how Jesus spoke to them, which can, seem dangerous, especially to mainliners. And they began doing church. Now, this is about money. This is about the depression now, not about a disease. And so remember, we have these two things linked, but this is just about the depression. And so what happened was all these little kinds of goofy churches grew. And it was a very strong period for the growth of what we now know to be American fundamentalism and even contemporary evangelicalism. And so the emphases in these groups were on the empowerment of lay people and lay people taking the ministry into their own hands. They were on immediate experience. They were indeed on healing, in the sense that God will take care of you, sort of, and meaning making. And so sermons and revivalists and evangelists that help people understand how this crisis sort of fit in the overall vision of God, were groups that succeeded. Now, they might have come up with ideas and meanings that you or I might find kooky, or maybe potentially even, unbiblical or harmful or what have you, but they helped people make sense of the moment. And I think that becomes the call, is towards lay ministry, towards valuing the experience of all of God's people, not just saying what the rule book thinks or what the leaders of a particular group think, but that the experience of the whole community matters, so that sense of empowerment and the sense that we're all really truly in this together and we all make a difference, and then that sort of sense that there is some level of meaning here. And those kinds of voices are the ones I think will rise to the top. The third point is pretty simple, is that in addition to provoking a crisis of, are we going to survive, for already stressed churches, the Great Depression provoked a crisis of identity. And that is the crisis of, well, who are we really? Which should be a question that comes out of issues of survival. It should never be just a question of, do we have enough money to pay the bills? But the bill paying question, it moves towards, well, wait a second, who are we? And who are we called to be? And so in mainline Protestant circles, Methodist circles, Episcopal circles, UCC, or well, they were just called the Congregationalists then, the Disciples of Christ, Lutherans, etc., this crisis of identity took two forms. One was it began to ask deep questions about the theology that we had embraced. And it broke forth a kind of theological creativity in the middle part of the 20th century that surprised everybody. And so this is the great period in which, Bonhoeffer's voice begins to be heard, and the Niebuhr brothers begin to do their work, and Dorothy Day's work begins to become public. She's Catholic, of course, but what she's doing really presses itself into the public square. And and Howard Thurman, and you begin to hear the voice of people outside of Christian tradition, like Gandhi, and voices from the two-thirds world, the global South, that were beginning to argue against colonialism. All of these threads began to sort of be born, especially in the 1930s. And then they will become major theological themes of the later part of the 20th century. And so provoke that theological crisis. And going along with that, the second part of the identity crisis was a crisis around social concern. And one of the real ironies of the whole period of the Great Depression was that what we had known as the social gospel in the late 19th century and the first couple years of the 20th century, that had really sort of ebbed away. But when the Great Depression comes in, it comes roaring back, and it's when it roars back. I love this. One of the articles I read was about the valley in California, and it will probably shock people in your area to hear this, but Christians in California, especially the ones that were more influenced by these radical, like Pentecostal movements and things like this, they became the people who pressed most for Roosevelt's New Deal. Socialism emerged among the Pentecostal groups that were growing. And there's an entire book called The Vision of the Disinherited that talks about how people who came out of the Dust Bowl and moved to California were the people who pushed hardest for a government that would provide an incredible social safety net. And when FDR was elected, they were completely on his side. Mm-hmm. And they were the people who laid the groundwork among regular people for the acceptance of the New Deal. And so that whole business about social concern, when it roared back from mainliners, it roared back in Pentecostal circles, and people really took it seriously. What does it mean to be a Christian who has a moral responsibility for good government, for equality, for the sharing of social pain, and for the alleviation of social pain? And that all happened because of the Great Depression, and it happened because Christians in this country made it happen. And then the last one, and I think this is really kind of interesting, and I suspect we'll see this, is that there was no great religious depression for ethnic congregations. Small, marginalized congregations in particular, ones that were always on the edges, ones that had to depend on each other in order to survive. Those are congregations that, they lost people certainly through the Great Depression. They were economically disadvantaged, but they already had within them high capacities of sharing and mutual care. And so one of the things that, because they were all poor to begin with, and so when the Depression came, they were just poorer, and they began this process of figuring out ways of caring for one another. So Mormon congregations actually did pretty well. We have record of Catholic parishes, which were largely ethnic at the early middle part of the 20th century. They did very well. Jewish synagogues did extraordinarily well during the Great Depression, partly because they were being fed by immigration from Europe, people fleeing the early phases of fascism. And they knew how to take care of one another. And there is good evidence that a high number of Black churches, particularly in the South, that were used to being stressed, that were used to being economically disadvantaged, that this became a moment of new practices of caring for one another. And so they managed their way through it. And then, of course, a lot of those people did as well as groups leave the South and move to places like Chicago, where they literally would take almost whole congregations and relocate them in areas that they felt would be more economically advantageous, as well as less, what they hoped would be less racist. So those are the four things from the Great Depression. Already strained institutions failed, innovative institutions made it. There was a great identity crisis in theology and social concern that actually turned out pretty well in the long run for the Christian tradition in the 20th century. And ethnic congregations remain as committed as ever to mutual sharing and care, and managed to make it through better than congregations that had a sense of privilege.
Yeah, some of these points also remind me to lift up for a moment the voices of persons of color. Mm-hmm. Jackie Lewis and Tracy Blackman, William Barber.
Yep.
There are a number of people, certainly indigenous groups, that have been telling us for many years to care for the earth. This is Earth Day. And the ways that or the entire continent of Africa with the Ubuntu and kind of ethic to them. So I think that in certain ways, if I may be so bold, the very privilege that a lot of white people carry also is a little bit of a handicap right now, in terms of, if you believe you are not dependent on others, that you can do for yourself, that you can make it, that you are your own thing, then in a moment like this, where the evidence of how much we truly need each other is very present in our lives,
Right.
we have a lot to learn from these other groups, to be able to find a way of being that will sustain us in this moment, and then to be able to hopefully re-script something, like a seed that's being planted has to pop open from what it was in order to grow into something more beautiful. The world is a very diverse place. And yet I have found in my ministry, we still like to self-segregate in a lot of ways. And in spite of everybody telling us, hey, it's a big world, it's a global world, and we may have a few friends over here, a few friends over there, but in order for us to work together to what we might be able to be through this, where we may have to look at things substantially differently, in how we interact, and learn some of the lessons that other people, other communities, have naturally had to learn because of their systemic oppression of different groups.
Yeah.
So I also appreciated your ingenuity section. If you're ingenious, if you can, and it says throw away the rule book, keep the values, but throw away the rule book. You don't have to throw away the values with the book. And I think sometimes people get that confused.
And I hate saying that, because people think, oh my gosh, anarchist,
Yeah.
she's undercutting the authority of the bishops, what have you.
Yeah.
Good religious leaders right now know that the rules that were written were not written for this moment,
That's right.
and that the rules are good, and the rules do provide for us certain kinds of frameworks so that we can live together in ways that work, or at least provide for maximum creativity and maximum transmission of our traditions when things are normal. But nothing is normal. And in case anybody hasn't known, Congress is throwing away rule books, medical facilities are throwing away rule books. Literally everybody knows that right now there is a need. And it's not, I don't want to say it's like Trump, oh, I'm going to go with my gut, so everybody go out and take a pill that's going to poison you. That's not what's being argued here. But instead, what is truly the case is that, well-formed lay people in the Methodist Church, or well-formed lay people in the Episcopal Church, and thoughtful clergy who care about their congregations, and bishops who are skilled and mature human beings with deep spiritual lives themselves, they all understand that things are going on here that have never gone on before. And that in order to meet the need of the day, we've got to go outside of the box. And that's what I mean by throw away the rule book. I don't mean you're poisoning people. I don't mean you're burning your hymn books and what have you. But you know what? Maybe there's and this is a good example of that. You don't know how to use Zoom. I don't barely know what it is. And so we're learning new technologies, and
Yes.
technologies that particularly mainline churches have been very, very afraid of, and very reluctant to employ. And that's just one example of going outside the box. And then, of course, the whole arguments about, communion. Can you celebrate communion virtually? And, my sense is that not everybody's going to want to do that, but there are places where that's going to want to work. I had a friend whose father died of this week, and my friend is a priest, and my friend had to celebrate the last rites with his father over FaceTime. Now, am I going to say that that's not going to work? That Jesus isn't there? No. I mean, I would be a monster if I was a bishop who said, oh, you can't do that, you know? And we don't have any clue how the presence of God shows up in that, you know? But I can tell you the Jesus that I know would show up in that. I mean, it makes me cry just thinking about it.
Mhm.
And so, that's what we have to keep in mind. This we serve, we worship, we're filled by a God who is completely love, and a God who is completely love, who is feeling all of this pain and all of this confusion, all of this uncertainty with us. And that God right there, that God might not wave a magic wand and fix everything tomorrow, because lots of theological stuff that we know to be the case. But what we do know about that God is with us, and that God loves us. And so, however we make that message clear, through whatever technologies, through whatever bending of whatever rules, through the tossing out of whatever we need to toss out, and the bringing in of new things that make it certain, those are things we have to be willing to experiment with this particular moment. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to do it this way for all of history. It just means that right now we're in an emergency, and we have to be able to act in a faithful, interesting way that lets the whole world know that God loves and God is with us. And so that to me seems like it's the whole point of the thing in both pandemics and in depressions and in the combining of the two, is that the point is right now, somehow we have to get the message of comfort and care and the practices of comfort and care out and communicated and into the world that is really hurting. And we have to be as imaginative and creative and as innovative as possible at a moment that we don't want to do that because we would rather cry. And it's that twofold sort of mission of the church. I think that's actually what happened in the second century during that plague, is that the church both provided comfort and healing, and it was as innovative as it could possibly be given where it was in its timeline. And somehow the comfort of God and the courage of God combined, and that became the witness to the ancient Roman world. And I think that that is truly the combination that we really need to seek today, is the comfort, the pastoral ministry, the kindness and love of God, combined with the courage to embody the fullness of God's love and healing power, however that happens in the circumstance in which we find ourselves. And so that's a really interesting call. And frankly, you know, I don't feel like particularly doing either of them. You know, I'd rather cry all day.
I think that we're in a shift right now, and we're working through a lot of grief.
Yeah, we really are.
Everyone is working through grief right now.
Right.
And then, but the question I think that you're bringing forth right now leads you right back to the beginning of where you started with what the church was doing. And the question is for us, can we, even in the midst of our grieving,
Right.
surrender to what's happening with love through this something more that we call God, even for such a time as this, that God is in the valley, not just the mountaintop? Can we, in this moment, like the first Christians, be fearless enough?
Right.
Can we stand in ourselves in such a way and trust in God in such a way that we can have the courageous, hope-filled audacity to actually rewrite the rules and
Right.
be okay knowing that God is helping us with this, that it is not a rejection of God, that a change from the past is not a rejection of God, is not a rejection of our values, is not a rejection of church or a faith community, but it is exactly the opposite.
Right.
that
It needs,
God is not static. God is a flow that continues, and
right.
in this moment can flow through us in new ways, in exciting ways.
Yeah. And it's because it's an emergency. It's a crisis. And that means it's outside of the realm of the normal flow of things.
And who knows?
And who
Even when we
knows?
come out of the emergency, something awesome may be happening if we are courageous enough to be faithful and fearless
Right.
in this moment.
Yeah. And I just want to encourage people, because I know that this is not easy. It's far easier. Literally, I just said it. I would rather be sitting in my office all day and just crying, because am I that comforted? No, I feel afraid. Am I that courageous? Not really. But I also know, you know, I, I know Jesus. And for gosh sakes, that's what really matters. And to believe that we were born for times such as this is the thing that I hold on to. So I want people to know that I'm not lecturing to people. I am speaking with and among all of this pain, is that I'm as scared as anybody and as chicken as anybody. And yet I know that there's another way. And I'm really working towards doing the best with that other way that I possibly can every single day of this nightmare. And I just ask that you would too, if you're hearing my voice, because there's really nothing else for us to do right now. Unless, of course, you're a doctor or a nurse, or you're a scientist developing a vaccine or what have you. You have a different calling, and thank God for you. But you know what? Thank God for all of us right now. For people who stay home, who are heroes. For people who, like me, are fundamentally trying to find that the courage to do what is right in this moment. For you, Anna, for your congregation, for anybody who takes the risk to live in a moment of crisis and just even do what seems to be the smallest act of kindness or the smallest act of courage. When we add up all that kindness and all that courage, it's going to make a difference for the future of all of this. And so that's what just keeps me going too. It's really literally one step at a time.
Thank you
And
so
Jesus,
much.
but that's the thing, is that Jesus is really with us.
Yes,
Yeah,
truly.
truly.
And but yet I just really appreciate your willingness to share from the things that you've learned and are learning, the things you're thinking about, and your willingness to share your own vulnerabilities and your own real feelings in this moment. That is courage. That is courage.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I've 3 people who were in my closer circles died yesterday, and so I can't say that I had a very good day. And financial stresses and all the things. We've all got it, and none of us is immune. So, but I appreciate a chance to talk to you, because you know how much I admire you, and I think you're a great human and a good friend. And the people in Bishop are lucky to have your beautiful presence among them as their pastor. So thanks for asking me to be with you today.
And I'm grateful for you. You know that. I'm a huge Diana Butler Bass fan.
Oh, I just want a friend.
I'm both. I can be both.
You can be both. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
You
That's
are
very
my
much.
friend, and I don't know what I would have done in my time in Alabama as I was going through all these learnings. I would just call you, and you would be so supportive and loving, and it has meant a lot to me, your friendship in my life, and certainly this means a lot to me, and I think it will mean a lot to my congregations or anyone that links onto our Facebook site or whatever. So thank you so very much. And I'm here for you if you need anybody,
Oh, thank you.
always. So I'm going to close this out now. And well, let me see if there's anybody. Is there anybody that had a question that they particularly wanted to ask? I'm going to just give you one second to ask it in the Q&A. But if we don't have somebody to pop up in a minute, I probably should have said that before. But as Diana was saying, I'm relatively new to Zoom webinars and trying to learn these things as I go. But I'm not seeing any particular question right now, so that's good. Maybe they don't know where the Q&A is. But anyway, I'm so grateful for the people that I see that have stayed on. And Bomi Kim raised her hand. Wait, she's saying wait.
Oh, she's trying to figure out a way
Trying
to
to figure out how to do it. Let's see. Oh, she just says it was amazing. Bomi says it was amazing. So Bomi is a yeah. So hi, Bomi. Bomi is yeah. Bomi is a person serving a Korean church in Atlanta.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and she worked with me at Walnut when we were together here in California before she finished Claremont.
Oh.
So yeah, so we
well, Bomi.
Yes.
I have to you show respect.
Yeah.
After. So I love I've been to Korea and I love that culture and I love those people. It's a great culture. And so many incredibly smart Korean American women are becoming theologians right now. I am blown away. As a matter of fact, I sit in awe of my sisters. So
yes.
Talk about a community that is coming into its own. Very impressive.
There are some awesome people in that community, and Bomi just said thank you so much for the respect. So anyway, but thank you again, and thanks everybody that was on this with us, and blessings to you and to all of us as we continue on learning and growing in this season of quarantine and COVID. So
peace of the Lord.
Peace be with you. Bye.
Bye-bye.